afternoon to everyone in Australia, and good morning to those of you who are joining us from India. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as extend a particular welcome to any Indigenous peoples with us here today. My name is Amanda Gilbertson, and I'm a research fellow in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. And I'm joined today by Trent Brown, who's also a research fellow, but in the School of Geography. Trent is also the author of the monograph, Farmers, Subalterns and Activists, and co-author of India, Continuity and Change in the 21st Century. Trent and I are both recipients of Discovery Early Career Researcher Awards from the Australian Research Council, and we'll be talking to you today about our DECRA, that's Discovery Early Career Researcher Award, research. Our aim in today's seminar is to explore education policy in the context of a hybrid Indian state. And I'm going to share my screen with you now just to give you a sense of some of the background of that concept of the hybrid state. So the Indian state has long been characterized by porousness. In an article published in 1995, Akhil Gupta argued that at the local level, the state appears not as a coherent entity, but as discrete and fragmentary, and that the boundaries between state and civil society are blurred. For Gupta, much of this boundary fuzziness had to do with the embeddedness of bureaucrats and politicians within local social hierarchies. More recent scholarship has attributed the porousness of the Indian state to the growing intersection between business and politics. Asima Sinha, for example, argues that the Indian state has become more porous as business interests have moved inside state agencies, such as parliamentary committees, and as more politicians have invested in business activities. For Asim Prakash, the blurred boundaries between state and business amount to a hybrid state that aggressively promotes withdrawal of the state from markets and formal mechanisms of governance, while at the same time engaging in informal practices of rent seeking that are socially regulated through identities of caste, religion, and gender. For Prakash, there is fuzziness not only in the boundaries between state and business, but also between formality and informality. Trent and I ask what the arena of education policy tells us about these blurred boundaries, this porous or hybrid state. Indian education systems have long been characterized by the involvement of non-state actors, from the missionary schools established during the colonial period through to the growing power of international agencies and private schools and colleges since the 1990s. In urban areas today, around half of children attend a private school. When it comes to higher education, according to some estimates, over 60% of institutions are private. While we know a lot about diverse actors' involvement in education delivery, less attention has been paid to the complex networks of alliances through which contemporary education policy is devised and enacted. In this seminar, Trent and I explore two major education policy initiatives. I will talk about the Right to Education Act of 2009, and Trent will discuss the Skill India program of 2015. Both of these policies have been developed and implemented by a hybrid state in which government actors work in alliance with NGOs and for-profit entities. We ask, what are the implications of this increasingly hybrid state structure for the coherence of policy, government accountability, and educational outcomes? Trent and I will each speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then there'll be lots of time for questions and discussion. If you think of any questions or comments, feel free to pop them in the chat as we're speaking, and we'll address them when we're both finished. So on to my presentation. I will be talking to you about fieldwork that I conducted alongside my colleague Joy Today in Lucknow between August 2019 and March 2020. I'm going to be presenting some very preliminary analysis of this complex network of individuals and organizations who are involved in implementing a particular part of India's Right to Education Act. And I welcome any suggestions for how to take this analysis further. But let me begin with a vignette from Lucknow. Some days after Joyita and I had interviewed her, a mother called us in distress. She was unable to pay the private school fees of her 2 eldest children and was worried that they would soon be expelled. She wanted us to call the Basic Shiksha Adhikari, the BSA, or Basic Education Officer, and ask him to arrange for the fees of her children to be waived, or for him to pay her children's school fees. We informed her that we did not have that kind of influence over the BSA, the Basic Shiksha Adhikari, and promised to try and find another solution. When Joyita and I spoke about it, we were initially puzzled as to why this mother would expect a government officer to intervene in a matter of private school fees. But as we talked about it, we realized that this is precisely what occurs as part of the policy that we were researching, Section 12(1)(c) of India's Right to Education Act, which requires private schools to educate underprivileged students without charging school fees. We had interviewed this mother because her younger child was being educated under this policy. Although her 2 older children had begun their education before Section 12(1)(c) came into effect and had thus been ineligible, this mother was aware that the boundary between state and private education was permeable. The blurred boundaries of the state that this mother had alerted us to are clearly evident in the implementation of Section 12(1)(c) in Lucknow. Before we get there, though, let's quickly explore how the policy was developed in the first place. One of the goals of Section 12(1)(c) is to create a common school system consisting of schools that are attended by all children in the neighbourhood. The notion of a common school system has its origins in the National Education Commission of 1964 to 66, popularly known as the Kothari Commission. The Kothari Commission noted that there was increasing segregation in the school system with, quote, the minority of private fee-charging better schools meeting the needs of the upper classes, and the vast bulk of free, publicly maintained but poor schools being utilised by the rest. The Commission called for the establishment of a common school system to, quote, bring the different social classes and groups together and thus promote the emergence of an egalitarian and integrated society. In such a system, privileged children would have opportunities for, quote, sharing the life and experiences of the children of the poor and coming into contact with the realities of life. Many believed that commitment to the vision of neighbourhood schools had waned in the 1990s, but in the drafting of the Right to Education Act of 2009, Section 12(1)(c) was seen as a way towards realising this vision by including the private sector rather than through government schools alone. A former government official who was involved in the drafting of the Right to Education Act explained this reimagining of the neighbourhood school as a private school. In discussions of Section 12(1)(c), the view was that a common school system should include both government and private schools. According to this former official, the drafting committee had initially considered stipulating that even a larger proportion of the class needed to be RTE or Section 12(1)(c) students before settling on 25% as sufficient to substantially transform the classroom. This government official stressed that representatives from private schools had not been involved in these discussions, and that those who were involved had a biased perception of private schools as elite institutions making very large profits. Although the Right to Education Act came into effect in 2010, Section 12(1)(c) has been very unevenly implemented across various states. In Uttar Pradesh, where Joyita and my research is based, only a handful of students were admitted to private schools under Section 12(1)(c) for several years. The catalyst for Section 12(1)(c) implementation in Uttar Pradesh was the arrival in Lucknow of a young woman who had left a career in management consultancy in the US to return to India and get involved in development work. This young woman, who I will call Muskan, drew media attention to the failure of the UP government to implement Section 12(1)(c) and pressured the chief minister at the time, Akhilesh Yadav, until he agreed to do something about it. Muskan also fostered relationships with senior government officers to build support for her work within the bureaucracy. Since 2015, the NGO that this woman runs has worked very closely with the state to implement Section 12(1)(c). They have educated local level officials about the policy, have built the website through which parents apply for Section 12(1)(c), and, in the absence of a state-run awareness campaign, have taken sole responsibility for spreading information about the policy among potential applicants. Muskan works tirelessly to maintain the state's commitment to Section 12(1)(c), for example, by organising events for the BSA, that's the Basic Shiksha Adhikari, to felicitate high-achieving Section 12(1)(c) students. Here we see that the boundaries between state and civil society are extremely porous, as an NGO seems to work within the state to implement this policy. Some elite private schools in the city have refused to give admission to students allocated to them through Section 12(1)(c). The state is relatively powerless to enforce the policy. They can write to the education boards to which these schools are affiliated and ask them to deregister offending schools, but so far this has proved ineffective. Thus, for enforcement too, the state is reliant on others. The courts have been an important mechanism of enforcement. Section 12(1)(c) has resulted in a large number of public interest litigations, and courts routinely rule in favour of students rather than private schools. Middle class and working class activists have also played a role by protesting outside offending schools, drawing media attention to the issue, and in one case through a hunger strike. Thus far, we have the state, an NGO, the courts, and activists involved in implementation and enforcement of Section 12(1)(c). A final actor to add to the mix is the corporate sector in the form of corporate social responsibility. While the state is involved in ensuring students are admitted to private schools under Section 12(1)(c), they do not play a role in ensuring that these students are well catered for after admission. One of the schools in our study was running free after-school homework support classes for Section 12(1)(c) students, and we're funding this through corporate social responsibility funds from an airline. The boundaries of the state are porous not just when it comes to implementing and enforcing the policy, but also when it comes to resisting it. Although the state has set up a website for Section 12(1)(c) applications to minimize rent seeking, the website is unable to circumvent the power of private schools. It is up to private schools to report how many Section 12(1)(c) students would constitute this mandatory 25% of their new entrance classes. And we heard from several different interviewees that schools underestimate this number. For example, when we asked one Lucknow bureaucrat whether it is up to schools to self-report how many seats they have available for RTE students, she responded, quote, "Yes, and we all know that what they report is not true, but we have to get them going." Here we see the fragmentary nature of the state. While policymakers in Delhi might have envisaged Section 12(1)(c) as leading to the radical desegregation of private schools, this bureaucrat saw it as simply providing access to decent education for a lucky few. During our fieldwork, many interviewees used the phrase hand in glove to describe the relationship between the state and privatized education. Interviewees pointed out that opening a private education institution is often a way for political aspirants to establish a public image for themselves before entering politics. Politicians are also frequently hosted by private schools as VIPs on days of significance. The close relationship between politicians, bureaucrats, and private school leaders was made clear to us when we interviewed a representative of the Private Schools Association. He already knew which politicians and bureaucrats we had spoken to, including those we had spoken to only a couple of days earlier. He told us that the day before, he had had an off-the-record lunch meeting with the Deputy Chief Minister and the Director of Basic Education, in which they had been very amenable to his proposal that the 25% Section 12(1)(c) quota be reduced to just 5%. Interviewees explained to us that this hand-in-glove relationship between state and private schooling underpinned the UP government's initial reluctance to implement Section 12(1)(c) prior to Muskan's intervention, and explains the ability of many elite private schools to get away with not implementing the policy since then. Let's see a couple of things here. Yeah, there's not that many slides. Onto the conclusions. All right, so what does all of this mean? What are the implications of this network of policy implementers? First, I think the story of Section 12(1)(c) implementation in Lucknow points to the ways in which the categories of state and society are in a continuous process of construction, rather than being fixed, coherent, and discrete entities. This is most clearly evident in the ways that different actors in the implementation network distance themselves from one another. Muskan, for example, identifies as a policy entrepreneur, distancing herself from typical NGOs, who she perceives as achieving only short-term amelioration through project-based service delivery, rather than long-term change through influencing the state. But although she identifies with the private sector language of entrepreneurialism, she sees herself as being in opposition to the self-interested profit-seeking of private school operators and others in business. Representatives from private schools distance themselves from a purportedly inefficient, ineffective, and corrupt state, but also from other supposedly more profit-driven private schools. And representatives of the state distance themselves from profit-hungry and exclusive elite private schools and idealistic but unrealistic activists and development professionals. All of these actors position themselves as acting for the social good, but their definitions of society and good differ, and it's through this process of working together while distancing from one another that these categories of state, society, and market are constantly being constructed. Second, this story supports Asima Sinha's argument that we need to, quote, go beyond the common assumption that economic liberalization amounts to a withdrawal of the state. Far from shrinking, we see that the state remains very much involved in education, albeit in a complex network of alliances. A key question then is whether this hybridization or porousness represents a weakening of the state, or whether we might agree with Hansen and Steputat that, quote, the strength of the modern state seems to be its dispersion and ubiquity. Finally, the story of implementation of Section 12(1)(c) in Lucknow has implications for thinking about rights-based policy in India. Many have asked whether the proliferation of rights-based legislation during the UPA government of 2004 to 14, and by rights-based legislation, this includes rights to information, work, and food, as well as education. So many have asked whether this body of legislation represented a counter-movement against neoliberalism. I think the story of Section 12(1)(c) provides support for Priya Chako's argument that rights-based legislation in fact supported the neoliberalization of the Indian state by promoting market citizenship. And by market citizenship, Chako is referring to this idea that the role of the state is to facilitate citizens' access to markets. Section 12(1)(c) facilitates underprivileged families' access to private schools, but also allows the state to carefully navigate its relationship with private providers of education, working with a range of collaborators to both implement and undermine the policy, using mechanisms that crisscross the boundaries between formality and informality. That's it from me today. Really looking forward to comments and questions. It's over to Trent now.
Everyone, I'll just get my slides up. Sorry. Okay, can you see that? Okay, good. So Amanda's been exploring this sort of blurring of boundaries between public and private sectors in relation to schooling. I want to explore that in the realm of skill development. So it is progressing. Okay. So around 2009, India set itself the task of rapidly expanding its skill development capacity. The Modi government rebranded this as Skill India, and it's featured a very prominent role for the private sector. Broadly speaking, this accords with a global neoliberal policy consensus, namely that skills imparted through vocational training should align with industry demand. That not only benefits industry, but gives trainees a better chance of getting ongoing employment. These assumptions are evident in Australia's TAFE system, which seeks industry input into curricula and industry involvement in work placement. But India's taken this private sector involvement substantially further, involving private sector actors in everything from policy formation to curriculum and program design, to the recruitment of trainees, the administration of training programs, assessment of graduates, and job placement. Public institutes continue to be involved to an extent, and the entire Skill India initiative draws largely on public funds. But the overall thrust is to involve private sector actors wherever possible. So, as you might expect, scholars in the social sciences have been critical of this. I myself find the rationale for such a prominent private sector focus to be questionable, given that most Indian people don't find employment and livelihood in formal private sector industries, but rather in forms of self-employment in the informal sector. Nandini Guptu notes that there's a tension in the policy aims of Skill India between facilitating private sector growth and the provision of social welfare in the form of employment and dignified livelihood. She suggests the heavy private sector involvement means things tend to tip in favour of industry. There's also been a series of recent studies which suggest the proliferation of private skill development providers has had the substantive effect not of upgrading skills, but of drawing on government funds to recruit youth from remote areas of the country and sort of deliver them as this constant supply of cheap, ready-to-exploit labour for industry in the cities, with little, if any, premium on wages for their training. Their research was on skills training for a lower level employment in the formal sector, specifically garment sector work. My research over the last few years has been looking at the implementation and impact of skill development programs, not for employment, but for small-scale entrepreneurship in the informal sector, specifically in agriculture. And in agriculture, the effort to involve the private sector in skills training has played out in a different and much more paradoxical way. So this is my very crude attempt at a flowchart to give you some sense of the hybrid state structure that's been developed to implement the agri-skills agenda. And I've arranged this so that if you draw a line, let me see if I can do this. If you draw a line down the center here, basically everything on the left would be public, and everything on the right would be private. So the overall policy framework comes from the Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship, which, along with private capital, funds the National Skills Development Corporation, or NSDC, which then devolves responsibility to the Agricultural Skills Council of India, or OSCE, which has developed curriculum for mostly short duration modular training programs after consultation with industry, which is largely agribusiness, but also from some public, from some government entities. And these trainings are then implemented by a diverse array of training providers, both public in the form of agricultural extension agencies and research institutes, and by private entities, NGOs, for-profit trainers, and agribusiness firms. Finally, private sector organizations have been enlisted to conduct the assessment of trainees. So as a picture of this hybrid state structure began to cohere in my mind, I saw just how much of it seemed to encourage input from agribusiness and facilitate private sector involvement, I wondered whether this whole apparatus had just been set up in an attempt to redefine agricultural skills in a way that would benefit agribusiness, which was worrying considering that most of India's agriculture is performed by smallholding farmers who often see agribusiness as their chief antagonists and exploiters. So, for example, would training just be an opportunity to promote the sale of new agri-technologies to farmers, basically a marketing exercise? Or would they encourage the use of business models like contract farming that tend to benefit agri-procurers and processors more than they do farmers? At the same time, it looks like these sort of entities down the bottom here, these sort of private training providers, might just get an opportunity from this to draw on public money in forms of sort of rent seeking. But how is it that all of this works in practice? Well, let's go through all of this in a little more detail to clarify exactly what the role of the public and private sector are at these different levels and what the implications might be. So we'll start with the NSDC. So the NSDC is a not-for-profit company set up as a public-private partnership in 2008. Its aims are very explicitly to facilitate the growth of for-profit entities in the skill development space. You can see that from this quote here, which I've just found in their About Us section on their website. So the NSDC finances training programs, which are affiliate, so they finance training programs which affiliated training providers administer. And in partnership with sector skill councils, or SSCs, they provide support services to enable the growth of these training providers, namely the development of curricula, assessment procedures, standardization, and so on. These SSCs are also autonomous private entities and usually registered as either not-for-profit companies or societies. In agriculture, the relevant SSC is the Agricultural Skills Council of India, OSCE, mentioned before. They identify the skills needs of the agricultural sector and develop qualification packs and model curricula to address them. So far, they've developed more than 160. In formulating these, OSCE consult with relevant industry partners. So that consists of agri-input companies like Mako, procurement companies like Cargill, and those in the agri-logistics sector, such as the cold storage company Blue Star. But they also seem to have consulted with public institutions involved in administering agricultural training. So that's what I've sort of indicated here, notably the Indian Council of Agricultural Research, ICAR. So when claims are made that this is an entirely industry-led initiative, we're talking about a very broad definition of industry, which might involve some sort of mental gymnastics. It's not entirely private sector involvement. So we see signs of this hybrid approach in the overall profile of the qualifications packs and model curricula that OSCE has developed so far. So alongside these kind of qualification packs in agri-crop production, sort of basic agricultural skills, and sort of some that are aligned with sustainable development objectives, these ones. We also see qualification packs on agri-information management, basically becoming a private extension provider, which itself is often code for working in marketing for agri-chemical retailers. We also see others that seem more clearly aligned with industry interests, such as developing skills for agri-exports markets. About half of the qualification packs developed so far develop skills in high-value, export-oriented agricultural commodity production, so things like floriculture, meats, silviculture. Then there's some for skills to support the agri-inputs industry. There's a set of qualification packs related to seed industry, for example. There's also a series related to post-harvest supply chain management, so warehousing, ripening facilities, cold storage, and so on. In terms of what's in each qualification pack, I think the involvement of public institutions like ICAR has meant that they're mostly fairly balanced, with a few eccentricities that perhaps bear the mark of that private sector input. So for example, in the dairy entrepreneur training, which is a very popular training program, there was a focus on basically all of the things that you'd expect to cover: shed design, maintaining a comfortable, hygienic environment for animals, handling and storing feed, animal health, milking, entrepreneurship. And in most cases, the required learning outcomes were sufficiently broad that they could be adjusted to the needs of those aspiring to both small scale and large scale dairies. But in a few places, there are some strange references that assume trainees will be working in large corporate dairies, of which there are remarkably few in India. So trainees are taught to report incidents to their supervisors, for example. So I mean, that's quite unusual given that every trainee who I interviewed who'd enrolled in the dairy entrepreneur training was not interested in working under a supervisor. They were learning skills for self-employment. Other things, the qualification pack refers to buying and administering feed according to the manufacturer's specifications, but not on how to prepare one's own feed using locally available materials. Trainees were supposed to gain competencies in using milking machines, but there's no requirement to impart skills on how to milk by hand. It sort of comes across like the qualification pack is not only out of touch with the situation of most Indian dairy farmers, but also that there may be some intention to encourage forms of agriculture that are more integrated with agri-input suppliers. On marketing and entrepreneurship, the qualification packs are not specific. They say trainees should be able to discern from different potential buyers and develop strategies based on their own unique situation, and that feels appropriate. The concern is, however, that what happens if it's an agri-procurement agency administering the training? Then leaving things open is essentially leaving it open for them to use the training as an opportunity to make a sales pitch. Well, here's the thing about that. I contacted more than 30 private providers who were registered to provide OSCE training programs in the parts of North India where I was doing my research. And that included private training, like for-profit training providers, NGOs, and agribusiness firms. And I found no evidence that any of them were doing any agricultural training at the time of my research. And in most cases, they explicitly said they weren't. Those who gave me the time for a short interview about why they hadn't done so despite registering were pretty clear on the reasons why. The NGOs thought that OSCE's training programs were too admin heavy. Private providers or for-profit providers said they just couldn't find a workable business model for it. They saw limited demand for training related to agriculture. So much for the private sector taking over the administration of training. This meant that in practice, as far as I could discern, almost all training was being implemented on the ground by public providers. The process here was that OSCE made an agreement with the Indian Council of Agricultural Research to administer a certain number of trainings each year through their affiliated agricultural extension centers. ICAR's zonal coordinators would look at various factors and determine which of the qualification packs to allocate to each trainer. In the North Indian zone where I did my research, they hadn't allocated any of the qualification packs related to agricultural machinery, agri-logistics, or those directly in service of agri-input industry. The trainings that they had allocated were those based on the skills which they knew were in demand amongst farmers, which was skills for profitable side business. So it was things like animal husbandry, beekeeping, mushroom cultivation, protected cultivation, organic farming, that sort of thing. So not these more agribusiness focused qualification packs. So despite the work that OSCE had put into devising these qualification packs for supporting agribusiness growth, in the pathways towards implementation, a lot of those got filtered out in favor of trainings that were more directly relevant to farmers. Once assigned, training programs were implemented by two kinds of institutions of agricultural extension, namely Krishi Vigyan Kendras, which are district-based extension centres, and the extension departments of agricultural universities. So these are publicly funded institutions, and their chief mandate is to support increases in farmers' yields and income. To that end, they tended to smooth out even the fairly minor pro-corporate stances in the OSCE curriculum. So to keep with the dairy example, yes, they'd teach trainees about feeds and mineral mixtures they could buy on the market, but they were also aware that most farmers won't be able to afford that on a regular basis. So in class, I observed that they'd engage farmers in dialogue about what sources of fodder they had available locally, and they'd collectively problem solve about how to make good use of what they had. Trainers saw the purpose of training as supporting India's small to medium scale farmers, and certainly not to supply a labour force to agribusiness or to support greater value chain integration, what you might expect if this were a purely corporate-led project. In my interviews with trainees in these programs, both during and a year after training, overwhelmingly they were hoping to engage in small-scale entrepreneurship activities. They weren't hoping to work as employees for agribusiness. There was no evidence that training led any of the trainees I interviewed to tighten their relationship with agribusiness, for example, through contract farming. Actually, in networking amongst themselves, they became more aware of the fact that working with agribusiness could only ever be profitable for those working at a much larger scale than they were. Finally, at the end of each training program, trainees are assessed by private sector companies who are independent of the training provider. At the time I started my research, OSCE had accredited 7 assessment companies to oversee knowledge and competency-based assessment tasks. Of these 7 companies, some had been specifically set up to assess Skill India programs and were hence specialized in skills-based assessment. However, at least 3 of them were specialized in testing for purposes of corporate recruitment, so doing personality tests, for example. Trainers that I interviewed were concerned that assessment was being done by people with no experience in agriculture, and they questioned whether they could really assess the skills of what were in many cases farmers who had been practicing for decades. Well, I'm not sure the involvement of private sector actors per se was the issue here. I did find it odd that funds were being given to these companies to administer assessment when the rationale for doing assessment wasn't entirely clear. Given all of the trainees were aspiring to self-employment in some form, what were they being assessed for? It's not like their certificate would be necessary for them to get a job. Failing a test only served to undermine their confidence. And here, it's worth returning to the value that trainees themselves invested in having certified skills. For them, the main reason for passing a test was that they believed that having a certificate would allow them to gain access to bank loans and government subsidies. When I followed up with trainees a year after training, however, it was apparent that when they approached banks and relevant government departments with requests for supports, none of these departments recognized their training certificate. They said they'd never even heard of OSCE. So here I wonder whether this commitment to private sector involvement actually blinded OSCE to other more creative solutions. If the main benefit for trainees of certified skills is to access government schemes and subsidies, perhaps it's these departments who should be, enlisted to assess their skills. What emerges is that despite the effort to involve the private sector in sort of skill development provisioning, in the end, this is an initiative which is very much led by public sector actors. On the ground, training tends to support the mandate of public sector extension providers of improving smallholding farmers' income and yields, rather than a more productivist focus on efficiency or integrating farmers into agribusiness supply chains, or supporting the growth of big agribusiness generally. My guess would be that the same is likely true across the informal sector. When training is for small-scale self-employment, I see little incentive for the private sector to get involved. These are activities for which there's no huge demand for training. Most skills for the informal sector are acquired informally, so there's not much scope for mass delivery. And because almost all trainees are aiming for self-employment, there's no scope for using the training as a mechanism for recruiting a cheap labour supply for industry, as others have reported in relation to training for the garment sector. The question that's still lingering in my mind, though, is why there is nonetheless this rhetorical commitment to private sector involvement. Why do multiple actors seem to be going out of their way to suggest the private sector is playing a greater role than it is? Why does the NSDC say that its primary interest is in facilitating private sector involvement in the administration of training? Why does OSCE make an effort to involve industry in curriculum development, even if their perspectives are not hugely relevant to what's going on the ground? And why spend public funds on private sector assessors when there's little real benefit in doing so? is there a sense in which they're just holding a space in the anticipation that the private sector will eventually step up and play a greater role in the future? Or is this an ideological commitment to the neoliberal policy line, sort of keeping the faith in the transformative power of big capital? I don't have answers to these questions, but I think they're worth asking, and I'd love to get your feedback. So that's me.
Thanks, Trent. Love those concluding questions, especially. Really a lot to think about there. If anyone has any questions, you can pop them in the chat or raise your hand and we can unmute you and turn your videos on so that you can engage a little bit more directly. Any comments or questions? Oh, I can see some hands up. Omkar and Radhika. Shall we start with you, Omkar, and then go to Radhika and then to Lakshya? Let me see if I can. So you should be able to unmute yourself, Omkar. Do you know how it works, Trent? I can see, oh, there we go. Ask to unmute.
Have you pressed ask to unmute?
Yeah.
Okay. Perhaps we could go to Radhika then.
Yeah,
and
Radhika, do you want to
perhaps
ask?
Omkar, you could possibly submit your question in the chat.
Hi, Trent and Amanda. Really interesting presentations. Thank you. Really enjoyed them. I was wondering about, the government itself. I mean, there's a lot of conversation about the private sector and the other non-state actors, NGOs, or the private sector itself. But I was wondering about the, historically the kind of the Babu culture in the government, and why that might actually be an image that they want to get away from. And, thinking of like the private sector has the aura of being more perhaps efficient, less corrupt perhaps, which is a bit surprising considering that's not how we think of, the private sector in other parts of the world. And I was wondering about that. And the NGOs always have had, the good people kind of aura around them. So I think they're less controversial to have around. But the private sector, perhaps it's this whole idea of, they're efficient and they are unlike the government, they're not corrupt. I wondered if you have any comments on, the government itself and the changing or unchanging image of the government.
Did you want to start, Trent, or would you like me to?
Yeah, I can say a little bit. I mean, yeah, I think that image of the sort of Bapu culture is definitely part of the rationale for why the private sector has been asked to play such a prominent role in skill development, especially when training has historically been administered by the industrial training institutes, which has sort of been seen as being out of touch, especially out of touch with industry demand, and very sort of top down in how they administer training, and not functioning particularly well. I suppose that the reason why I find that a little bit peculiar is why has that assumption been sort of carried over to the informal sector as well, where perhaps it makes sense if you're talking about car manufacturers that, yeah, the ITIs are not very much in touch with industry demand, and it's important to have more private sector involvement there. But if you're training people for self-employment and entrepreneurship, where is this sort of rationale for more industry involvement? It doesn't quite seem intuitive to me, but it seems to be very influential in policy circles.
Thanks for the question, Radhika, and it actually makes me think a little bit about what my answer might be to Trent's final sort of question around whether this was about holding a space for the private sector or about an ideological commitment. And it reminds me of a recent paper by Elizabeth Chatterjee about the Gujarat model. And Chatterjee argues that although the BJP government, while in power in Gujarat, and now, as Modi's government, has this kind of tagline of, I think it's small government, large, small government, large governance, or I don't know which exactly the words were, but it was like about reducing the size of government and increasing governance. And Chatterjee's arguing that actually there hasn't been this shrinking of government, that the state remains very involved in regulating the market and is very involved in industry in Gujarat and now nationally as well. But there's this rhetoric of reducing government. And Chatterjee's argument is that this is important as part of the kind of state image. There we go. Omkar, thanks. Minimum government, maximum governance was Modi's line. And so I think Chatterjee would argue that in response to your question, Trent, that it is around this rhetoric, and it's about getting away from that image of the state as being sort of less agile perhaps than the private sector, and about building this kind of new image of the state as this kind of agile, business friendly actor. In how that connects to the Right to Education Act, I think is complicated around this Section 12(1)(c) thing, which is so much more tied to this rhetoric of private schools as kind of profit hungry and less to this kind of efficient private sector, inefficient state kind of dichotomy. Does that answer your question, Radhika?
Yes, it does. And it's made, of course, it's, all of us, I think, are going to be thinking some more about this. Excellent questions prompted by the two presentations. Thank you.
Thanks, Radhika. Omkar, were you able to unmute yourself, or did you want to pop a question in the chat?
Hello. Hi. Yes. Bye. Yeah. Hey. It was actually quite interesting when Trent talked about the transfer, whether there is a transformative power of the private sector. It actually related. It actually has a relation to what you said about the schooling sector, right? In the 1990s, the number of students who were attending private schools were about 10%. I think that was in 1996. Despite public education being free and private education being costly, the parents overwhelmingly chose to send their kids to private schools. Like you were saying, the overall Indian numbers for private enrollment now is 50%, which has pretty much happened over the past 25 years. I wanted to check whether, and there is actually an assumption here, right, that the private sector is still able to function despite the laws. And I was wondering whether any sort of research has been done by comparing the two sets of schools, one where the right to education has been implemented, and the second set of schools where it hasn't been implemented.
Oh, great question. And exactly that research hasn't been done. So there's many different states all implementing the policy in slightly different ways with different levels of rigor. The research that does exist is much more around the effect of the policy on different types of private schools, because obviously many private schools, in fact the majority, are relatively low fee, far from elite schools. And the other aspect, sort of complicating aspect to your question, is that I've talked about one aspect of the Right to Education Act, which is this requirement that schools take on 25% of their new entrants should be from underprivileged families. But in addition to that, there are all sorts of regulations around minimum student-teacher ratios, minimum infrastructure, and so on. And the argument that's been made against the Right to Education Act is that it's impossible for schools to comply with all of those regulations, and that this enhancement of regulation becomes an opportunity for increased rent seeking from state officials. And so the data that has been used to show that the act is problematic and unsustainable for private schools has been the closure of private schools. And there is evidence that some schools have closed, but it's very ambiguous. It's really not clear what have been the primary causes of closure, and with the pandemic resulting in, you know, mass school closures for quite different reasons, it's become even more difficult to assess, you know, to what extent the Right to Education Act has impacted on the profitability of schools, and what aspects of it specifically have been the most impactful in terms of the sort of costs of schools. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there is actually one legal exception as well, which is that linguistic and religious minorities, if they are running a school, then they are exempt for RT.
Yeah.
Which to me makes it a good case of understanding and evaluating how those cost structures have changed. So one is with those who have an exception, and the other is those who did come into the ambit of the law, where there might be a flawed implementation in some cases, a very good implementation in other cases. But I think that's an interesting question to study.
Yeah, great suggestion. Lakshya, I think your hand was up next. I'll just allow you to talk.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, thanks, guys. That was a great presentation. My question is to Trent. Trent, I was really interested to know, the interaction that you had with the trainees. Given that you said that the assessment that they got and the certificate that they got, that really didn't help them to get more capital. What was the real impact of the trainings then? Was it more aspiration-led? Did they develop an entrepreneurship mindset, or were they really implementing the knowledge that they'd learned, or were they interacting with the trainees a lot, and were they looking forward to more training? So I'm just really trying to get a better picture of that aspect, and especially if you had interactions with women farmers, just share that. Thanks.
Yeah, so I would say that the impact was fairly mixed, but when I sort of tried to quantify the number of trainees who were actually doing something with the skills that they'd acquired, it was more than half of them who, in some way, you know, they'd managed to take particularly the technical skills and go out and do something with them. I think they were a little less impressed by the entrepreneurship skills that they got. There's not a sense in which they went on to take really innovative business models, but, you know, learning the technical skills in mushroom cultivation or dairy entrepreneurship, or, you know, dairy farming, I should say, did allow, you know, a good number of them to get started in a new initiative. And, you know, it was 1 year between first, you know, interviewing them at the training and then doing a follow-up interview. So there's only so much that you can do in 1 year. Yeah, I think in terms of the technical skills, the impacts were pretty good. The real issue was, as I sort of indicated, that a lot of them, a lot had actually come in with the expectation that the training would get them access to subsidies and bank loans from which they could start a much larger scale operation. And that eventuated for a very small number of them. And for those for whom it did, it had nothing to do with the training certificate that they did get those subsidies and loans. That was just because of their own initiative. And that was really problematic, because a lot of them had gone out and made investments, drawing on their personal funds to, you know, if it was a dairy, someone who'd done training in dairy, they might have gone out and built a large shed, and then not been able to get the loan. They weren't able to actually buy the cattle to fill it up. So it was sort of a stranded asset for them. So very problematic that aspect of the scheme wasn't functioning properly. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks. And anything particular that you noted with women trainees, or was it the trends were just general?
Yeah, women were much more likely to have actually done something with the skills that they'd acquired. And I think the main reason for that is men, and particularly young men, if they happened to get any offer for other forms of employment, they would take that and drop the plans for agriculture. And also women had to do a lot of sort of bargaining with their families just to attend the training in the first place. So there was a lot of pressure on them to actually do something after they'd done the training. So women were most commonly enrolled in the mushroom cultivation training, and then some in the organic farming one. So amongst those who'd done mushroom cultivation training, which was considered to be important for women because it's an enterprise they could do from home without working out in the fields. yeah, a number of them had started small scale businesses, which I think were, more important than the amount of money they were making was just that they had something that was uniquely their own, that really had a lot of value for a lot of them. So I wouldn't downplay the potential of these trainings at all. That was really quite meaningful in a lot of people's lives.
Great. Thanks, Trent.
Do we have any other questions? Either in the chat or if people want to raise their hands. Radhika, did you want to ask another question? Or just
don't have an and I've still been thinking about this, and also thinking about, I think CSR was mentioned, and I think CSR plays an important part in this as well. Because on the one hand, the government has been trying to look more corporate, and the corporations have been trying to look more, kind of socially responsible. And I think that ethos also has, and I think prior to this, actually, Ben and I wrote something about how any kind of a singular order is, impossible to sustain. And I think this idea of, how we've come to think of public and private in particular ways, I think, in the Western world. And, which is why some of these things seem odd to us. But I think the historical context that you provided helps greatly. I think in the situation where it is seen as it's impossible for the government to do everything, there's a completely different kind of understanding of, when the private sector enters, it's not, it's increasingly now, I think, more of for their own profit kind of thing. But I think in the past or historically, it's been as an aid to a newly independent, not wealthy state. So I think some of that, and if you think of some of the big industrialists, the Tatas and the Birlas and so on, and their kind of engagement, I think there may be some historical explanations that might also shed some light, as you have already pointed out through your, starting with the Kothari Commission, etc.
Yeah, you actually connected there with another question I had for Trent, which was around the connection between jobless growth and corporate social responsibility. So there's this really fantastic recent paper by Sunila Kale called From Company Town to Company Village, which talks about some of these big industrialists and the kind of company towns that were built to house workers in steel companies and mines and so on. But now that so much industry is capital intensive rather than labor intensive, the kind of social responsibility of corporations is no longer in the form of providing employment and looking after your workers through healthcare and education and so on. And corporate social responsibility actually becomes a mechanism through which companies can keep people at a distance and direct their aspirations away from the company and towards other forms of employment. So my question for you, Trent, was around whether maybe you're dealing with this conundrum around the fact that none of the people undertaking this training were aspiring to work for agribusiness. And so I wonder if there's something else going on there around the kind of goals of agribusiness and the goals of the state in terms of directing people's aspirations in certain directions away from employment.
Yeah, it's not really something that I can speak to too directly. I mean, I'd say that the last time I checked, the number one source of corporate social responsibility funds was skill development. So this is, and the National Skill Development Corporation does encourage CSR funds to think about how they can support skill development in a lot of different ways, including like giving scholarships for students from marginalized backgrounds and for women and things like that. I didn't find any examples of CSR being directly involved in these training programs that I was looking at. I did look briefly at another initiative which was completely funded by CSR money, but it wasn't, it didn't come under the umbrella of what OSCE was doing. So they were using apps to sort of encourage more efficient forms of dairy production. And I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't really be able to say what the real motives are, but you could sort of imagine that increasing the overall output from Indian cattle, and a lot of the way that this initiative sort of framed it was that Indian cows produce something like 40% less milk than what you would expect from those particular breeds, so that there was a lot of capacity for increasing dairy output, and that might be beneficial for companies like Nestle and Verka who source their milk from small scale dairy farmers. So it's possible that there's an alignment of interest. I don't know. I can't really speak to it though.
Yeah. There's a question from Amrita in the chat for you, Trent.
Oh, okay. So was there any information or research in regards to solar energy training and women's skill development in the agricultural sector? Not particularly, not that I've come across. I mean, I think you could look at more sort of non-formal skill development initiatives like the Barefoot College. So I think there's been quite a bit written about that in terms of women in solar energy and agriculture, but not that I've come across in terms of the formal structure of the Skill India initiative.
All right, thanks everyone. We're kind of out of time. I've just popped some details in there of the next Australia India Institute Fellows seminar. It'll be on the 14th of October on the topic of Australia and India's shared vision for the Indo-Pacific. So if you could keep an eye out for the Australia India Institute newsletter, there'll be more details of that seminar coming soon. Thanks, Trent.
Thanks, Amanda.
Everyone that was here.
Thanks
really
everyone for coming.
Yeah.
Okay.